America likes to tell a simple story about itself, a story of millions, of endless opportunity, of open land and open doors and people arriving from everywhere, mixing freely, starting fresh. It is a comforting story. It is also incomplete, because beneath the flags and the slogans and the immigration charts, there is a quieter force that does not care about ideals or fairness or narratives. A force that shapes populations long before laws exist, long before institutions form, long before anyone talks about equality. That force is survival, not survival in the abstract sense, not hard work pays off, but biological survival under pressure. And the truth is this: the United States was shaped not just by who arrived, but by who made it through a series of brutal genetic filters. Filters so quiet, so slow, and so mathematical that most people never notice them. Yet their effects are still visible today, in families, in regions, in institutions, and in outcomes that refuse to disappear. This is the story of the DNA bottleneck that quietly shaped the United States. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you're new here, subscribe now. This channel exists for people who want to understand not just where America came from, but why it turned out this way. To understand this story, we have to start by stripping away a misconception, one that even educated people carry without realizing it. Most people think genetics shapes individuals. Tall parents have tall children. Athletic parents have athletic children. That kind of thinking is familiar and comfortable. But genetics does its most powerful work not at the individual level, but at the population level. Over time, through filters, a DNA bottleneck happens when a large population is suddenly reduced to a much smaller one, not necessarily by extinction, but by pressure, disease, starvation, isolation, migration, geography, violence, choice. When that happens, the genetic makeup of the survivors becomes disproportionately important, not because those traits are better, but because they are the ones that remain. Chance becomes destiny. Traits that were once rare become common. Traits that were once common disappear entirely. And once the population begins to grow again, it grows outward from that narrow base. A bottleneck doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need mass graves or global headlines. It just needs math. And America experienced not one bottleneck, but many. The first one came before the country even existed. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a route. It was a biological gatekeeper. In the 17th and 18th centuries, crossing the Atlantic was not migration as we understand it today. It was a psychological and physical ordeal that selected for a very specific subset of humanity. The journey took weeks or months. You lived below deck in darkness, packed tightly with strangers, surrounded by sickness, filth, and the constant motion of the sea. Food spoiled, water ran out, disease spread quickly, panic spread faster. If you were prone to severe anxiety, you did not survive the crossing. If you were physically fragile, you did not survive the crossing. If you were indecisive, you often never boarded the ship at all. This is the first uncomfortable truth. The people who arrived in early America were not a random sample of Europe. They were already filtered. Even before the first settlement was built, selection had occurred. The Atlantic crossing removed people who could not endure confinement, uncertainty, prolonged stress, and the real possibility of death with no escape. History remembers who showed up. Biology remembers who survived. And then came the second filter. Arrival did not mean safety. In many cases, it meant something worse. Early American settlements were not stable societies. They were experiments conducted at the edge of human tolerance. Food shortages were common. Medical care was primitive. Winters were lethal. Disease was poorly understood. Conflict was frequent. Entire colonies failed and vanished. Others survived by the thinnest margins imaginable. When mortality is high, survival is not evenly distributed. It never is. Some people survive because they are stronger. Some because they are healthier. Some because they have better immune responses. Some because they happen to be in the right place at the right time. Some because someone else died instead. Biology does not sort by virtue, it sorts by outcome. When half a settlement dies in a single winter, the survivors do not just carry memories forward, they carry genes forward. And when those survivors form the core of a growing population, those genes become overrepresented, not because they are ideal, but because everything else was removed. This is what a bottleneck looks like in real life. Quiet, brutal, unsentimental. Now here is where the story becomes more interesting and more uncomfortable. Survival alone does not shape a nation. Reproduction does. After the initial filters of migration and settlement, many early American communities entered long periods of isolation, geographic isolation, religious isolation, social isolation. In those conditions, populations grow inward before they grow outward. People marry who is available. Families intermarry. Surnames repeat. Kin networks thicken. This is not ideology. It is logistics. When a population is small and isolated, reproduction patterns matter more than individual achievement ever could. Families that have more children leave more descendants. Families that marry young expand faster. Families that remain intact over generations compound their presence in the population. Power does not begin with money. It begins with multiplication. This is why some lineages explode across history while others vanish entirely. Not because they were smarter or more moral or more deserving, but because they survived, reproduced, and remained socially cohesive long enough for mathematics to take over. If this sounds abstract, consider this. If two people have 10 children, and those children survive and reproduce at similar rates, within a few generations their descendants number in the thousands. Within a few centuries, they number in the millions. No conquest required, no conspiracy needed, just time. This is one of the reasons early American populations expanded so rapidly. Clean water, dispersed settlements, abundant land, lower disease load than European cities, high fertility, high survival rates after infancy. The result was exponential growth rooted in a narrow genetic base. This is where the American myth begins to diverge from biological reality. We imagine a constant influx of new people blending into a uniform whole. But for long stretches of early American history, immigration slowed or stopped entirely. Wars, political upheaval, and economic conditions reduced new arrivals. During those periods, population growth came almost entirely from natural increase. People already there having children, lots of them. This meant that the genetic and cultural traits of the founding populations became amplified, not diluted. America was not always a melting pot. For long periods, it was a pressure cooker. Now let's address something carefully, because this is where conversations often go wrong. Survival does not equal superiority. Persistence does not equal virtue. Genetic concentration does not equal destiny. A bottleneck does not produce better people. It produces more similar people. It increases the frequency of whatever traits happen to be present at the moment of narrowing. Some of those traits may be useful in certain environments. Others may be neutral. Some may be harmful. The bottleneck does not judge, it only counts. This matters because the United States did not experience a single, unified bottleneck. It experienced many, layered on top of one another. Different regions passed through different filters. Coastal trading towns selected for navigation, literacy, and commerce. Frontier zones selected for independence, risk tolerance, and physical endurance. Religious enclaves selected for conformity, discipline, and high fertility. Isolated valleys and mountains selected for self-sufficiency and resistance to outside authority. Over time, these differences hardened, not because people consciously engineered them, but because populations tend to reproduce themselves. Culture reinforces biology. Biology reinforces culture. Genes whisper. Culture amplifies. This is why regional differences in the United States persist far longer than anyone expects. Why certain attitudes cluster geographically. Why some areas value hierarchy and others resist it. Why some regions trust institutions and others distrust them deeply. These are not accidents. They are echoes. Now let's talk about the bottlenecks people don't like to talk about. Not all genetic narrowing happens through voluntary migration or environmental hardship. Some happens through exclusion, through law, through violence, through enforced separation. Enslaved populations experienced extreme bottlenecks through forced migration, brutal mortality, and deliberate family disruption. Indigenous populations experienced catastrophic bottlenecks through disease, displacement, and warfare. Immigrant groups faced quotas, segregation, and social barriers that shaped who married whom and who remained where. These bottlenecks created inequality without intention. Biology is indifferent to justice. It reflects power, not fairness. This is why ancestry is not evenly distributed. Why some lineages dominate records while others disappear from them. Why DNA reconnects branches that written history erased. If this makes you uncomfortable, that's a sign you're paying attention. At this point, a reasonable question arises. If genetics and bottlenecks matter so much, does that mean outcomes are predetermined? No. And this is where nuance matters. Genes do not dictate destiny. They influence probabilities. They load the dice, but they do not roll them. Most traits that affect behavior and ability are influenced by hundreds or thousands of genetic variants, each with a tiny effect. Environment matters, culture matters, opportunity matters, randomness matters. But here is the part people underestimate. Small advantages, compounded over generations, produce large differences. If one group is slightly more likely to survive infancy, slightly more likely to reproduce, slightly more likely to stay socially connected, and slightly more likely to pass on resources and norms, those differences accumulate. Not in one lifetime, but over 10, or 20, or 30. This is why some families persist at the top of institutions for centuries, while others cycle in and out. Not because they are biologically destined to rule, but because early survival and reproduction created durable networks that later advantages reinforced. Once institutions form, schools, churches, banks, guilds, universities, they tend to reproduce themselves too. They reward familiarity. They favor continuity. They amplify existing networks. Biology sets the stage. Institutions lock it in. Now let's bring this back to you. If you take a DNA test, it will not tell you whether you will succeed or fail. It will not reveal secret greatness or hidden flaws. Anyone who claims otherwise is selling mythology. What DNA can do is place you inside long arcs of survival. It can show you which populations your ancestors passed through, which bottlenecks they endured, which migrations they survived, which isolations shaped them. It can show you why your family story looks the way it does, why some branches disappear, why others multiply, why certain traits repeat across generations. This is not about pride or shame. It is about understanding forces larger than any individual. If you've ever looked at American history and wondered why inequality persists, why regional cultures feel stubbornly resistant to change, why some outcomes repeat despite reforms, this is part of the answer. The American dream did not begin on equal ground. It began in bottlenecks. That does not make the dream meaningless, but it does make it incomplete. Understanding this does not weaken the country. It strengthens it by replacing myth with clarity. And clarity matters, especially now. We live in a moment obsessed with identity, ancestry, and belonging. Millions of people are sending their DNA to labs, waiting for answers about who they are and where they come from. But DNA without context creates confusion. History without biology creates fantasy. This channel exists to bridge that gap. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this project was built for. Subscribe now. We release deep dives every week into the hidden structure of American ancestry. Stories that don't fit cleanly into textbooks but explain far more than slogans ever could. In the next episode, we're going to explore a group most Americans think they understand, but almost all of them misunderstand. A lineage so widespread that tens of millions of people claim it, yet few grasp what it actually means. Because the most powerful inheritance in America is not money, It is survival multiplied by time. History writes the names. Biology keeps the score. And once you learn how to read it, you start seeing the country and yourself very differently. We'll see you in the next video.